Sir, you need to return to your assigned seats. This first-class section is reserved for our premium passengers only. The words cut through the busy terminal gate like a blade, sharp and deliberate. Brad Sullivan, lead flight attendant for Atlantic Airways. Flight 447 from Atlanta to Chicago stood blocking the aisle with his arms crossed, his blue uniform pressed to perfection, his smile as fake as his authority was real. He wasn't asking, he was ordering. Behind him, Jessica Miller and Ryan Peters flanked the entrance to first class like guards protecting a fortress, their eyes scanning the family of four who had just settled into their upgraded seats with the kind of suspicion reserved for people they had already decided didn't belong. Before we dive deeper into this moment that changed everything, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your city in the comments below, and if what you're about to witness stops you in your tracks the way it did the other passengers on Flight 447, hit that subscribe button and give this video a like, because what happened next exposed a system of discrimination that went all the way to the top. Let's rewind to how this all started. Denzel Washington Jr. walked through Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport with his family, moving with the quiet confidence of a man who had built an empire from nothing. At 45, he wore a simple navy polo shirt, dark jeans, and white sneakers. No designer labels, no flashy jewelry, just a father traveling with his wife and two children on what should have been a routine business trip to Chicago. Beside him, Kendra Washington, 42, pushed their youngest daughter, Zara, 8, in a wheelchair. Zara had been born with spina bifida, and while she was bright and spirited, long flights were challenging for her. That's why Denzel had specifically requested the upgrade to first class when booking their tickets months ago. Their teenage son, Isaiah, 16, walked slightly ahead, earbuds in, completely unaware that his family was about to become the center of a confrontation that would expose the ugly truth about how some people still viewed black families in spaces they deemed too exclusive. The Washington family approached Gate A12, where Atlantic Airways Flight 447 was preparing for boarding. They had arrived early, as Denzel always did, partly out of habit from his business travels, but mostly to ensure Zara had enough time to board comfortably without feeling rushed. Ryan Peters, the gate agent, looked up from his computer screen as they approached the priority boarding line. His eyes immediately fixed on Denzel, then swept over Kendra and the children, lingering just a moment too long on their casual clothing and Zara's wheelchair. "Excuse me," Ryan said, his voice carrying that particular tone of polite suspicion that black families knew all too well. "Are you sure you're in the right line? This is for first class and premium members only." Denzel pulled out his phone, showing their boarding passes on the screen. Washington party of 4, first class, seats 2A through 2D. "We have confirmation numbers if you need them." Ryan squinted at the screen like he was examining evidence of a crime. "That's unusual. Let me verify this with the system." He turned to his computer, typing with exaggerated precision, making the family wait in full view of other passengers while he double-checked what should have been routine. Kendra squeezed Denzel's hand gently. She had seen this before. They both had. The extra scrutiny, the suspicious glances, the assumption that they must have made some mistake or were trying to game the system somehow. "Is there a problem?" Denzel asked, his voice calm but firm. "Just being thorough," Ryan replied, still staring at his screen. "We've had issues with people trying to use expired upgrades or duplicate confirmations." Isaiah looked up from his phone, sensing the tension. "Dad, what's taking so long?" "Just a moment, son," Denzel said softly, placing a reassuring hand on Isaiah's shoulder. But inside, he felt the familiar burn of indignation. Here he was, a man who owned 3 airports, including the very one they were standing in, being treated like a potential fraud by his own employee. The system showed their upgrade was legitimate, purchased months in advance, with premium seating specifically requested for medical accommodation due to Zara's condition. But Ryan continued to stare at the screen as if willing it to reveal some hidden deception. Other passengers in the priority line began to murmur. A businessman in an expensive suit tapped his foot impatiently. A woman in designer clothing checked her watch dramatically. The message was clear. This black family was holding up the line, causing problems, making things complicated. That's when Brad Sullivan emerged from the jet bridge, having overheard the commotion. He approached with the swagger of someone who believed his uniform gave him ultimate authority over who belonged where. "What seems to be the issue here?" Brad asked, directing his question to Ryan while barely glancing at the Washington family. "They're claiming to have first-class seats," Ryan said, emphasizing the word claiming like it was inherently suspicious. "The system shows an upgrade, but I'm having trouble verifying the payment method." This was a lie. The payment had been processed through Denzel's corporate account months ago, cleared by the same accounting department that processed thousands of legitimate transactions daily. But the lie served its purpose. It planted doubt, created justification for additional scrutiny. Denzel felt his jaw tighten. "Let me speak with your supervisor." "I am the supervisor for this flight," Brad replied smoothly, "and I'm going to need to see additional identification before we can allow you to board in first class." Additional identification, not just the boarding passes, not just the IDs they had already shown, but something more, something extra, because apparently being a black family with first-class tickets required additional proof of worthiness. Kendra looked down at Zara, who was watching the interaction with confused eyes. Their daughter was old enough to understand that something was wrong, that they were being treated differently, but young enough to not fully grasp why. The gate area had grown quiet. Other passengers were openly staring now, some with sympathy, others with the kind of curiosity reserved for watching a potential confrontation unfold. A few had their phones out, not yet recording, but ready. Thomas Reed, a marketing executive from Detroit, stood 3 people behind them in line. He had traveled extensively for business and had seen this scenario play out before. Black families, well-dressed professionals, and even celebrities were subjected to extra scrutiny that white passengers never faced. His finger hovered over his phone's record button. Amanda Clark, a teacher from Phoenix traveling with her elderly mother, watched from the adjacent seating area. She had witnessed discrimination before, but rarely so blatantly, so publicly. She quietly opened her Twitter app, ready to document what she was seeing. Meanwhile, Brad continued his performance of authority. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step aside while we verify your upgrade. There are other passengers waiting to board." "We're not stepping aside," Denzel said quietly. "Our seats are confirmed, our tickets are valid, and my daughter needs to board early due to her medical condition. We're not moving until you explain exactly what additional verification you need and why." The standoff had begun. Brad Sullivan, drunk on the small power of his position, had just challenged a man who could buy and sell the entire airline without checking his account balance. But neither Brad nor Ryan knew that yet. They saw only what they chose to see, a black family that needed to be put in their place. Jessica Miller approached from behind, having monitored the situation from the gate desk. Her smile was as practiced as it was cold. "Folks, we really need to keep the line moving. If there's an issue with your seating, we can sort it out once everyone else is boarded." "There's no issue with our seating," Kendra said, speaking for the first time, her voice steady but carrying an edge. "There's an issue with your staff treating paying customers like criminals because of how we look." The words hung in the air like an accusation, which they were. Jessica's smile faltered slightly. "Ma'am, I assure you this isn't about how you look. It's about following proper boarding procedures." "Then follow them," Denzel said. "Scan our boarding passes and let us board. It's that simple." But it wasn't simple, because the real issue wasn't their tickets, or their seats, or their payment method. The real issue was that Brad Sullivan and his team had looked at a black family and decided they didn't belong in first class, regardless of what their tickets said. Around them, the tension was building. Thomas Reed finally started recording, holding his phone low but capturing the interaction. Amanda Clark began typing a thread on Twitter. Watching a black family get harassed at ATL Gate A12 by Air Atlantic Air crew for trying to board their paid first-class seats. Isaiah had taken his earbuds out completely now, fully aware that his family was being singled out. He looked around at the staring passengers, the phone cameras, the growing crowd, and felt a familiar shame wash over him. Not shame for his family, but shame that this was still happening, that in 2024, his little sister had to witness their parents being treated like this. Zara tugged on her mother's hand. "Mommy, why won't they let us on the plane?" Kendra knelt down beside her daughter's wheelchair. "Don't worry, baby. We're going to get on our plane, and we're going to sit in our seats just like we planned." But as she said those words, Brad Sullivan made the decision that would ultimately cost him everything. He reached for his radio and called for airport security. "Gate A12, requesting security assistance. We have passengers refusing to comply with boarding procedures." The call crackled through the terminal's security channel, audible to anyone with a scanner, including the airport's operations center where Denzel's assistant Helena Cross was monitoring flight schedules for her boss's trip. Helena looked up from her computer screen, frowning. She pulled up the gate camera feeds and zoomed in on Gate A12. What she saw made her blood run cold, her boss, his wife, and their children being confronted by airline staff while security was being called. She immediately picked up her secure phone and dialed a number that very few people had access to. "Sir," Helena said when Denzel answered, barely moving his lips to speak. "I'm watching the gate feed. Security is en route. Should I intervene?" "Not yet," Denzel replied quietly. "Let them show everyone exactly who they are." Thomas Reed continued filming, his video now live on Instagram with viewers climbing by the hundreds. Amanda Clark's Twitter thread was being retweeted faster than she could follow the notifications. Word was spreading in real time about what was happening at Gate A12, and in an operations center overlooking the entire airport, Helena Cross began making a series of phone calls that would change everything for Brad Sullivan, Jessica Miller, Ryan Peters, and Atlantic Airways. The security officers arrived within minutes. Two men in uniform who had responded to countless calls like this one, most of them routine, some of them unnecessary, but all of them requiring careful handling in an era where every interaction was potentially being recorded and broadcast to thousands of people. Officer Martinez, a 20-year veteran of airport security, approached the group with the weary professionalism of someone who had seen this movie before. "What seems to be the problem here?" Brad immediately launched into his prepared narrative. "These passengers are claiming to have first-class seats, but we haven't been able to verify their upgrade. They're refusing to step aside while we sort it out, and they're holding up boarding for everyone else." Officer Martinez looked at the Washington family, taking in Denzel's calm demeanor, Kendra's protective stance beside Zara's wheelchair, and Isaiah's obvious discomfort with being the center of attention. Then he looked at the growing crowd of passengers with their phones out and realized he was potentially walking into a public relations nightmare. "Can I see your boarding passes?" he asked Denzel politely. Denzel handed them over without a word. Officer Martinez examined them carefully, then looked at the family's IDs. Everything appeared to be in order. "These look legitimate to me," he said to Brad. "What exactly needs to be verified?" Brad's confidence wavered slightly. "Well, the payment method was flagged in our system as potentially fraudulent." This was another lie, and Officer Martinez could sense it. In his experience, when airline staff started talking about flagged payment methods and potential fraud, they were usually grasping for justification after the fact. "Sir," he said to Denzel, "have you had any issues with your credit card or payment method recently?" "None whatsoever," Denzel replied. "The ticket was purchased through my company's corporate account. Same account we've used for years with various airlines." Officer Martinez turned back to Brad. "I'm going to need you to show me exactly what's flagged in your system." Brad's face flushed slightly. He hadn't expected to be asked for specifics, hadn't prepared for someone to actually investigate his claims. "Well, it's an internal system flag. I can't really show you the details." "Then how do you expect to resolve it?" Officer Martinez asked reasonably. The question hung in the air, exposing the fundamental flaw in Brad's approach. He had created a problem without a solution, raised concerns without evidence, and now found himself unable to explain exactly what needed to happen for the Washington family to be allowed to board their flight. Thomas Reed's Instagram live stream now had over 3,000 viewers, with comments flooding in from people expressing outrage and disbelief. Amanda Clark's Twitter thread had been retweeted over 500 times, with major travel bloggers and civil rights organizations beginning to amplify the story. In the operations center, Helena Cross watched the standoff continue and made another call, this time to Robert Hayes, the airport's head of legal affairs. "Robert," she said when he answered, "we have a situation at Gate A12. Mr. Washington and his family are being harassed by Atlantic Airways staff. It's being broadcast live on social media." "How bad is it?" Robert asked, already pulling up the social media feeds Helena was monitoring. "Bad enough that we're going to need a full incident report, and Atlantic Airways is going to need some reminding about their operating agreement," Helena said grimly. Robert Hayes had worked in airport operations for 15 years, and he knew exactly what Helena meant. Airlines that discriminated against passengers on airport property weren't just creating public relations problems. They were violating their contractual agreements and potentially exposing the airport to liability. "Keep monitoring," Robert said. "If this escalates further, we may need to intervene directly." Back at Gate A12, the situation was reaching a boiling point. More passengers had gathered to watch, some of them beginning to voice their support for the Washington family. "This is ridiculous," called out a woman in business attire. "I've been watching this whole thing, and these people haven't done anything wrong." "Let them board their plane," added a man in a baseball cap. "You're embarrassing yourself." But Brad Sullivan was too deep into his power trip to back down now. He had committed to his narrative, and admitting he was wrong would mean acknowledging that he had racially profiled a family in front of hundreds of witnesses and thousands of online viewers. Instead, he doubled down. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced loudly, "we apologize for the delay. We take security very seriously, and we need to ensure all passengers are properly verified before boarding." The announcement only made things worse. Several passengers began voicing their disapproval more loudly. Someone shouted, "This is discrimination." Another person yelled, "Let them on the plane." Officer Martinez realized the situation was spiraling out of control. He had seen enough confrontations turn ugly to know when it was time to de-escalate. "Sir," he said to Brad, "I need you to either produce specific evidence of fraud or allow these passengers to board. We can't hold up the entire flight based on vague concerns." Brad looked around desperately, seeing his authority challenged not just by the Washington family, but by the security officer, the other passengers, and the growing online audience that was broadcasting his every move to the world. That's when he made the decision that would end his career. "Fine," he said loudly. "If you won't help us maintain security protocols, we'll handle this ourselves. This family is not boarding this aircraft." The gasps from the crowd were audible. Thomas Reed adjusted his phone to capture Brad's face clearly as he made his declaration. Amanda Clark typed furiously, updating her thread with Brad's exact words. And in the operations center, Helena Cross looked at her boss on the security feed as he stood perfectly still, absorbing the full weight of what had just happened. "Sir," she said into her phone, "they've just banned you from your own airline." Denzel's response was so quiet that only his family could hear it. Not for long. The moment Brad Sullivan declared that the Washington family would not be boarding Flight 447, the atmosphere at Gate A12 shifted from tense to explosive. Passengers who had been watching quietly suddenly became vocal, their voices rising in a chorus of disapproval that echoed through the terminal. "This is insane," shouted a businessman who had been waiting to board. "I've never seen anything like this." "You can't just ban people for no reason," called out a young woman with her laptop bag slung over her shoulder. Thomas Reed's Instagram live stream was now approaching 5,000 viewers, with comments streaming by so fast he couldn't read them all. Amanda Clark's Twitter thread had been picked up by several verified accounts, including civil rights lawyers and travel journalists who were amplifying the story beyond what she had ever imagined possible. But in the center of the storm stood Denzel Washington Jr., still perfectly calm, still perfectly controlled, watching Brad Sullivan dig himself deeper into a hole that he didn't yet realize would bury his entire career. Officer Martinez stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had dealt with enough airline drama to know when lines were being crossed. "Sir," he said to Brad, "you cannot refuse boarding to passengers with valid tickets without cause. What you're describing sounds like discrimination, and that's a federal issue." Brad's face reddened. "I'm the senior flight attendant on this aircraft, and I have the authority to refuse boarding to any passenger I deem a security risk." "Based on what?" Officer Martinez pressed. "What specific behavior have you witnessed that constitutes a security risk?" The question hung in the air because everyone present knew the answer. There was no behavior. The Washington family had been polite, patient, and cooperative throughout the entire confrontation. The only thing they had done was exist while black in a space that Brad Sullivan believed they didn't belong. Kendra Washington knelt beside Zara's wheelchair, speaking softly to her daughter while the chaos swirled around them. Her voice was steady, but inside she was fighting the familiar rage that came with being treated as less than human because of the color of her skin. Isaiah moved closer to his parents, his teenage indignation finally overriding his embarrassment. "This is messed up," he said loud enough for everyone to hear. "We didn't do anything wrong." His words cut through the adult conversation like a blade, reminding everyone present that children were watching this unfold, that an 8-year-old girl in a wheelchair was being taught that her family wasn't welcome in certain spaces, regardless of their ability to pay for them. Jessica Miller, who had been standing behind Brad throughout the confrontation, finally found her voice. "Maybe we should reconsider," she whispered to her colleague. "This is getting out of hand." But Brad was beyond reason now. He had committed to his course of action, and his pride wouldn't let him back down, even as the evidence mounted that he was making the biggest mistake of his professional life. "No," he said firmly, "they don't board. End of discussion." That's when Denzel Washington Jr. finally decided it was time to end the charade. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. But instead of making a call, he opened an app that very few people had ever seen. The screen displayed a real-time overview of every airport he owned, including detailed operational data, security feeds, and executive controls that could override virtually any system in the facility. "Helena," he said quietly into the phone, "bring up my profile on the main display at Gate A12. In the operations center, Helena Cross's fingers flew across her keyboard. Within seconds, the large informational display at Gate A12, which had been showing routine flight information, switched to a different screen entirely. The display now showed a professional headshot of Denzel Washington Jr., along with text that made several passengers gasp audibly. "Denzel Washington Jeter, Chief Executive Officer, Washington Aviation Group Owner, Hartsfield-Jackson, Atlanta, International Airport, Owner, O'Hare. International Airport, Chicago Owner, Ronald Reagan, Washington National Airport." The terminal around Gate A12 went completely silent. Passengers stared at the screen, then at Denzel, then back at the screen, trying to process what they were seeing. Thomas Reed's phone camera captured the moment perfectly, the display clearly visible in his frame along with the stunned expressions of Brad Sullivan and his crew. "Holy," Thomas whispered into his stream, then caught himself. "He owns the airport. He literally owns the airport." Amanda Clark's Twitter thread exploded with retweets as she frantically typed, "Plot twist! The black man they're trying to ban from the flight owns the airport. This is incredible." Officer Martinez looked from the display to Denzel, then back to the display, his professional composure finally cracking slightly. "Mr. Washington," he said respectfully, "I had no idea." "Most people don't," Denzel replied calmly. "That's rather the point." Brad Sullivan stared at the display like it was written in a foreign language. His mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. Jessica Miller had gone completely pale. Ryan Peters looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. The crowd of passengers began to murmur, then to laugh, then to openly celebrate. Someone started clapping, and within moments, the entire gate area erupted in applause for the man who had just been banned from his own airport by his own tenant airline. But Denzel wasn't finished. "Helena," he said into his phone, "patch me through to the airport-wide announcement system." Within seconds, his voice was being broadcast throughout Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, reaching hundreds of thousands of travelers, workers, and staff members. "Good afternoon. This is Denzel Washington, Jr., CEO of Washington Aviation Group and owner of this facility. I want to address an incident currently taking place at Gate A12, where Atlantic Airways staff have refused boarding to my family based on what can only be described as racial discrimination." The announcement echoed through every terminal, every concourse, every gate. Travelers stopped walking to listen. Workers paused their tasks. Security personnel throughout the airport turned their attention to Gate A12. "I built this airport," Denzel continued, "to be a place where every traveler is treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their race, their appearance, or their economic status. What happened here today represents everything I stand against, and it ends now." At Gate A12, Brad Sullivan looked around desperately, as if searching for an escape route that didn't exist. The reality of his situation was finally sinking in. He had just discriminated against the owner of the airport in front of thousands of witnesses while being broadcast live to social media. Jessica Miller stepped forward, her voice shaking. "Mr. Washington, sir, I think there's been a misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding," Denzel replied, his voice still calm but carrying the weight of absolute authority. "You looked at my family and decided we didn't belong in first class. You created fictional problems with our payment method. You called security on paying customers. And when given multiple opportunities to correct course, you chose to ban us entirely." Helena's voice came through his phone speaker, audible to everyone nearby. "Sir, Atlantic Airways Corporate is online too. They'd like to speak with you immediately." "Tell them they can speak with our legal department," Denzel replied. "Mr. Hayes will be handling all communications with Atlantic Airways going forward." Robert Hayes, who had been monitoring the situation from the legal office, was already preparing the documentation that would likely result in Atlantic Airways losing their operating agreement at all 3 Washington Aviation Group airports. The crowd around Gate A12 had swelled to several hundred people, drawn by the announcement and the spreading news of what was happening. Airport workers had begun gathering as well, many of them recognizing their ultimate boss and wanting to show support. Officer Martinez approached Denzel with a mixture of respect and embarrassment. "Sir, I apologize for the situation. Is there anything you need from security?" "Just make sure my family can board our flight safely," Denzel replied. "And please document everything that happened here for the incident report." "Absolutely, sir." Meanwhile, Thomas Reed's Instagram live stream had been discovered by major news outlets. His viewer count had climbed past 10,000, and he was getting direct messages from CNN, Fox News, and other networks asking for permission to use his footage. Amanda Clark's Twitter thread had been retweeted over 5,000 times, with major celebrities, politicians, and activists sharing the story and demanding accountability from Atlantic Airways. But perhaps the most powerful moment came when Zara Washington, who had been quietly observing everything from her wheelchair, looked up at her father and asked in her clear, innocent voice, "Daddy, why didn't they want us on the airplane?" The question cut through all the corporate rhetoric, all the legal implications, all the social media buzz, and reduced the situation to its essential truth. A little girl had been taught that some people would try to exclude her family because of how they looked. Denzel knelt down beside his daughter's wheelchair, speaking loud enough for the cameras and the crowd to hear his response. "Some people make assumptions about others based on their skin color, sweetheart. They think they can decide who belongs where, but they're wrong. And when good people see that happening, they stand up and say, 'It's not okay.'" Zara nodded solemnly, then looked around at the crowd of passengers and airport workers who had gathered in support. "Are all these people good people, Daddy?" "Yes, baby," Denzel said, his voice thick with emotion. "They are." The crowd responded with another round of applause, but this time it was quieter, more respectful, acknowledging the teaching moment that had just occurred in front of them. Brad Sullivan, meanwhile, had finally found his voice, though it came out as little more than a whisper. "Mr. Washington, I didn't know. If I had known who you were." "That's exactly the problem," Denzel interrupted, standing back up to face him. "Your respect shouldn't depend on knowing who I am. It should be automatic for every passenger who walks through that door." The confrontation was effectively over, but the consequences were just beginning. Helena Cross had been fielding calls from Atlantic Airways executives, airport board members, and media outlets for the past 20 minutes. The story was spreading beyond social media into mainstream news, with major outlets preparing to run segments on the incident. Robert Hayes had completed his preliminary legal review and determined that Atlantic Airways had violated at least 3 clauses of their operating agreement, giving Washington Aviation Group grounds to terminate their lease immediately if they chose to pursue that option. And in airports across the country, other Washington Aviation Group facilities were being contacted by reporters wanting to know if similar incidents had occurred elsewhere. The display at Gate A12 updated again, this time showing a message that would remain visible for the rest of the day. Washington Aviation Group statement: "We have zero tolerance for discrimination in our facilities. All passengers deserve respect regardless of race, appearance, or background. Airlines operating in our airports are expected to uphold these values." As the crowd began to disperse and normal boarding procedures finally resumed, Denzel Washington Jr. looked around at the gate where his family had been humiliated, then transformed into a symbol of justice and accountability. Officer Martinez approached him one final time. "Sir, what would you like us to do about the Atlantic Airways staff involved?" "Document everything," Denzel replied. "Their airline will handle their employment status. We'll handle their access to our facilities." The message was clear. Brad Sullivan, Jessica Miller, and Ryan Peters would not be working in any Washington Aviation Group airport again. But as the Washington family finally prepared to board their flight, now with the full respect and assistance of every airline and airport employee present, Denzel reflected on the deeper implications of what had just occurred. This wasn't just about one incident, one airline, or even one family. This was about a system that still allowed people like Brad Sullivan to wield their small amount of power as a weapon against those they deemed unworthy. And that system was about to change, starting with the comprehensive reforms that Denzel Washington Jr. would announce in the coming days. Reforms that would reshape how discrimination was handled across the entire aviation industry. The plane was ready to board, but the real journey was just beginning. As Flight 447 taxied toward the runway, Denzel Washington Jr. settled into seat 2A beside his wife, watching Chicago's skyline approach through the small window. But his mind wasn't on the business meetings waiting for him in the Windy City. Instead, he was remembering another airport, another time, another moment when someone had looked at him and decided he didn't belong. It was 1998, and Denzel was 19 years old, traveling alone for the first time to a job interview in Dallas. He had saved for months to buy that plane ticket, working double shifts at a warehouse in Detroit while taking business classes at the local community college. The interview was for an entry-level position at a logistics company, nothing glamorous, but it represented hope for something better than the cycle of poverty that had trapped his family for generations. He wore his only suit, a navy blue hand-me-down from his older brother that was slightly too big in the shoulders and a little too short in the legs. His shoes were polished but worn, his tie borrowed from his father's closet. He carried a briefcase that his mother had bought him from Goodwill, telling him it was the most important investment she could make in his future. The flight from Detroit to Dallas had one stop in Atlanta, at the same Hartsfield-Jackson Airport where he now owned every runway, every gate, every square foot of terminal space. But in 1998, he was just another young black man trying to navigate a system that seemed designed to remind him at every turn that he was different, suspect, unwelcome. The connection time was tight, only 45 minutes, and Denzel had never been in an airport as large as Atlanta's. He hurried through the corridors, briefcase in hand, following signs toward his departure gate. When he finally found it, he was relieved to see that boarding hadn't started yet. He approached the gate agent, a middle-aged white woman whose name tag read Patricia, and handed her his boarding pass. She looked at the pass, then at him, then back at the pass with the kind of suspicious scrutiny that Denzel would later recognize as a pattern. "This is a business class seat," she said, as if he might not be aware. "Yes, ma'am," Denzel replied politely. "I upgraded when I bought the ticket." This was true. He had used his credit card to purchase the upgrade, knowing that the extra legroom would be worth it for the long flight and that arriving in Dallas well-rested would improve his chances in the interview. Patricia examined his ID, holding it up to the light like she was checking for counterfeiting. She looked from the photo to his face several times, then handed both documents to another gate agent. "We need to verify this," she said without explanation. Denzel waited, watching other passengers board around him. Business travelers in expensive suits walked past the gate agent without a second glance. A family with multiple children and carry-on bags were welcomed aboard with smiles. But Denzel stood in the corner, holding his boarding pass, while two airline employees treated him like a potential criminal. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The gate agent finally approached him again. "Sir, we're having trouble verifying your upgrade. You'll need to take a seat in coach." "But I paid for business class," Denzel said, trying to keep his voice level. "I have the receipt." She didn't want to see the receipt. She had already made her decision based on her assumptions about who belonged in business class and who didn't. "You can file a complaint with customer service," she said dismissively. "Right now, we need to get this flight moving." Denzel faced a choice: miss his connection and his interview, or accept the humiliation and take whatever seat they gave him. He chose the interview, walking down the aisle to coach while other passengers stared, some with sympathy, others with the kind of smug satisfaction that came from watching someone be put in their place. He sat in a middle seat between two large men, his knees pressed against the seat in front of him, his briefcase squeezed under the seat so tightly he worried it might be damaged. But worse than the physical discomfort was the psychological impact of being told, once again, that his money wasn't as good as someone else's, that his presence was tolerated but not welcomed. The interview in Dallas went well. Denzel got the job, starting at the bottom of the logistics company as a dispatcher, coordinating shipments and managing schedules. But every day, as he worked with airlines and shipping companies and freight forwarders, he remembered that flight from Atlanta. He remembered the feeling of being powerless, of having his dignity stripped away by someone with just enough authority to make his life difficult. Over the next 10 years, Denzel worked his way up through the logistics industry, learning every aspect of transportation and supply chain management. He started his own consulting firm, then expanded into freight brokerage, then into cargo handling. By his early 30s, he was managing logistics for major corporations across the Midwest. But it was in 2008, during the financial crisis, that Denzel saw his real opportunity. Airlines were struggling, airports were facing budget shortfalls, and infrastructure was being sold off to private investors at bargain prices. Denzel had been watching the industry for years, studying its weaknesses, understanding its pressure points. He formed Washington Aviation Group with a simple mission: to own and operate airport facilities while ensuring that every passenger was treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their race, background, or economic status. It was a business model born from personal experience, funded by careful investment, and driven by the determination to ensure that no one else would experience what he had endured in that Atlanta airport gate in 1998. His first acquisition was a small regional airport in Ohio, purchased from a cash-strapped municipality for a fraction of its actual value. Denzel immediately implemented new training protocols for all staff, focusing on customer service excellence and cultural sensitivity. He installed comprehensive surveillance systems, not for security theater, but to ensure accountability. Every interaction between staff and passengers was recorded, reviewed, and evaluated. The results were immediate and dramatic. Customer satisfaction scores improved by 40% within 6 months. Airlines began requesting additional routes through the facility. Revenue increased as word spread about the exceptional service and welcoming atmosphere. Other municipalities took notice. Within 3 years, Denzel had acquired 2 more airports, each time implementing the same principles of respect, dignity, and accountability. His staff training programs became industry models. His customer service ratings consistently ranked among the highest in the nation. By 2015, Washington Aviation Group had grown large enough to make a bid for one of the most prestigious airport management contracts in the country, Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, the same airport where Denzel had been humiliated 17 years earlier. The bidding process was intense, with major corporations and international consortiums competing for the contract. But Denzel's track record spoke for itself. His airports consistently outperformed industry standards in every metric that mattered: customer satisfaction, on-time performance, revenue generation, and safety ratings. When the contract was awarded to Washington Aviation Group, Denzel stood in the same terminal where he had once been treated as a second-class citizen. But this time, he held the keys to the entire operation. His first act as the new operator was to review every discrimination complaint filed in the previous 5 years. He found dozens of incidents similar to his own experience, cases where passengers had been subjected to additional scrutiny, denied services, or treated poorly based on their race or appearance. In most cases, the complaints had been dismissed or resolved with form letter apologies. Denzel implemented a zero-tolerance policy. Any airline employee found to be discriminating against passengers would be banned from the facility. Any airline that failed to address discrimination complaints would face review of their operating agreements. Every gate agent, every flight attendant, every customer service representative working in his airport would undergo mandatory bias training. The policy wasn't popular with everyone. Some airlines complained about the additional requirements. Some staff members resented the scrutiny, but the results were undeniable. Discrimination complaints dropped by 90% within the first year of Denzel's management. Word spread throughout the aviation industry about the changes at Atlanta. Passengers began choosing flights through Hartsfield-Jackson specifically because of its reputation for treating everyone fairly. Airlines that embraced the new culture found their customer satisfaction scores improving. Those that resisted found themselves facing increasing pressure to change their practices. In 2018, Denzel expanded his operations to Chicago, acquiring the management contract for O'Hare International Airport. The same principles that had transformed Atlanta were implemented in Chicago with similar results. By 2020, he had added Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport to his portfolio. Washington Aviation Group had become more than a business. It had become a symbol of what the travel industry could be when it prioritized dignity and respect over assumptions and bias. But success didn't insulate Denzel from continued discrimination. Even as one of the most powerful figures in the aviation industry, he still faced moments when people looked at him and saw only his race, not his accomplishments. There was the corporate dinner in 2019 where a board member from a major airline assumed he was the catering manager and asked him to fix the coffee. There was the industry conference in 2021 where a panel moderator introduced him as an example of diversity in executive leadership, as if his race were his primary qualification rather than his track record of transforming airport operations. Each incident reminded Denzel why his work mattered, why representation in positions of power was crucial, and why systems of accountability were necessary to prevent discrimination from flourishing in the shadows. He began sharing his story more openly, speaking at business schools and industry conferences about his journey from that humiliating experience in 1998 to running 3 of the nation's busiest airports. He talked about the importance of seeing potential in people regardless of their background and the business case for treating all customers with respect. The story resonated far beyond the aviation industry. Denzel received invitations to speak at civil rights conferences, business leadership summits, and diversity training programs. His autobiography, Flying While Black, A Journey from Discrimination to Leadership, became a bestseller and was adapted into a documentary that aired on major networks. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from passengers themselves. Letters poured in from travelers who had experienced welcoming, respectful service at Washington Aviation Group facilities. Parents wrote about how their children had been treated kindly by airport staff. Elderly passengers shared stories of receiving assistance without being made to feel like burdens. International visitors described feeling welcomed in America for the first time at one of Denzel's airports. Kendra Washington had been by his side through most of this journey. They had met in 2003 at a logistics conference in Chicago, where she was working as a supply chain analyst for a major manufacturer. She understood the challenges Denzel faced as a Black executive in a predominantly white industry, having navigated her own career in corporate America while dealing with assumptions about her competence and belonging. Their marriage in 2005 was covered by several business publications, not because it was newsworthy in itself, but because both were rising stars in their respective fields, representatives of a new generation of Black executives breaking barriers in industries where they had historically been excluded. When Isaiah was born in 2008, Denzel made a promise to himself and his son. By the time Isaiah was old enough to travel alone, the aviation industry would be a place where young Black men wouldn't face the same discrimination that had marked Denzel's early experiences. Zara's birth in 2016 added another dimension to that promise. As a Black girl with a disability, she would face multiple forms of potential discrimination. Denzel was determined to create systems that would protect her and others like her from the kind of treatment that had once been considered normal in the travel industry. The family traveled frequently, partly for business, but also as a form of research. Denzel wanted to experience his airports as regular passengers to see how his staff performed when they didn't know the CEO was watching. These undercover visits had led to numerous policy improvements and staff training adjustments over the years. But the incident at Gate A12 in 2024 was different. This wasn't a subtle microaggression or a small oversight that could be addressed with additional training. This was blatant, public discrimination perpetrated by airline staff who had been explicitly trained to avoid exactly this type of behavior. As Denzel sat on Flight 447, reviewing the events of the past hour on his phone through Helena's detailed incident report, he realized that this moment represented a fundamental test of everything he had built over the past 15 years. The footage from Thomas Reed's Instagram live stream had already been viewed over 100,000 times. Amanda Clark's Twitter thread had generated thousands of comments and been shared by major news outlets. The story was spreading rapidly through social media, with hashtags like Flying While Black and airport discrimination trending nationally. But more importantly, the incident had been witnessed by hundreds of passengers, airport workers, and airline employees. Everyone involved would remember this moment, and their memories would shape how similar situations were handled in the future. Denzel pulled up his secure messaging app and sent a note to Robert Hayes. Prepare a comprehensive review of all Atlantic Airways operations in our facilities. I want documentation of every complaint, every incident, every policy violation over the past 2 years. If this was systemic rather than isolated, we need to know. The response came back within minutes. Already in progress. Preliminary review suggests this wasn't an isolated incident. We may have grounds for immediate contract termination. Denzel looked across the aisle at Zara, who was coloring in a book while Kendra helped her. His daughter had handled the airport confrontation with remarkable composure, but he knew the impact would likely emerge later, in questions and conversations and perhaps in fears about traveling or being in spaces where she might not be welcomed. Isaiah was listening to music, but Denzel could see the tension in his son's shoulders. The way he kept glancing around the first-class cabin as if expecting someone to challenge their presence even now. At 16, Isaiah was old enough to understand the broader implications of what had happened, old enough to feel the weight of representing his race in spaces where Black faces were uncommon. The flight attendant on this aircraft notably had been nothing but professional and courteous from the moment they boarded. She had welcomed them warmly, ensured Zara was comfortable, and offered refreshments without any of the suspicion or hostility they had encountered at the gate. This was how the system was supposed to work, Denzel reflected. This was the standard he had tried to establish across his airports and the airlines that operated within them. But clearly, the message hadn't penetrated every corner of the industry. His phone buzzed with a call from Helena Cross. "Sir," she said when he answered, "CNN is requesting an interview for this evening's broadcast. They want to discuss the incident and your broader work on discrimination in aviation." "Set it up," Denzel replied, "but make sure they understand this isn't just about one bad interaction. This is about systemic change and accountability." "Understood." Also, Atlantic Airways Corporate has issued a statement apologizing for the incident and promising a full investigation. "Too little, too late," Denzel said. "Their investigation should have prevented this from happening in the first place." As the plane began its descent toward Chicago, Denzel thought about the speech he would give that evening, not just to CNN but to the entire aviation industry. He would talk about the progress that had been made, but also about how much work remained. He would challenge other airport operators and airline executives to examine their own practices and hold their staff accountable for treating all passengers with dignity. Most importantly, he would use this moment to advance the cause that had driven him for over 2 decades. Ensuring that no family would ever again face the humiliation that his family had endured that day, or that he had endured as a young man trying to make his way in the world. The wheels touched down at O'Hare, another airport in Denzel's growing empire, another facility where his principles of respect and accountability were being implemented every day. But the real work was just beginning. The incident at Gate A12 would become a catalyst for industry-wide changes that would reshape how discrimination was addressed in aviation. But first, there would be consequences for those who had chosen to perpetuate the very behaviors that Denzel Washington Jr. had spent his career fighting to eliminate. The news cycle moved fast in 2024, but some stories had enough power to break through the constant stream of information and capture the public's sustained attention. The incident at Gate A12 was one of those stories. By the time Denzel Washington Jr.'s plane landed at O'Hare International Airport, his airport, the footage from Thomas Reed's Instagram live stream had been viewed over 500,000 times. Major news networks were preparing special segments, civil rights organizations were issuing statements, and Atlantic Airways was in full crisis management mode. Helena Cross met Denzel's family at the gate, her tablet loaded with updates that painted a picture of a story spiraling far beyond what anyone had anticipated. "Sir," she said as they walked through the terminal, "the hashtag #FlyingWhileBlack is trending #1 nationally. The video has been shared by over 200 verified accounts, including several celebrities and politicians." Denzel nodded, but his focus was on his family. Isaiah walked beside him, still processing what had happened in Atlanta. Zara seemed more interested in the moving walkways than the media attention, but Kendra's expression showed the exhaustion that came from being thrust into the spotlight for experiencing discrimination. "What's Atlantic Airways' response?" Denzel asked. Helena pulled up the airline's official statement on her tablet. "They've issued an apology and announced that all 3 employees involved have been suspended pending investigation. They're also promising a comprehensive review of their customer service policies." "Suspended, not terminated," Denzel noted. "That tells us everything we need to know about how seriously they're taking this." They reached the airport's executive lounge, a private space where Denzel could conduct business without the scrutiny of other travelers. As soon as they were settled, Helena began briefing him on the broader implications of the incident. "The FAA has already reached out," she said. "They want to discuss whether this represents a pattern of discrimination that could affect Atlantic Airways operating certificates." Robert Hayes, who had flown up from Atlanta, joined them in the lounge with a thick folder of documents. His expression was grim. "It's worse than we thought," he said without preamble. "I've spent the last 4 hours reviewing Atlantic Airways incident reports at our facilities over the past 2 years. This wasn't an isolated event. He opened the folder, revealing dozens of complaint forms, internal memos, and incident reports. We found 17 separate complaints about discriminatory treatment by Atlantic Airways staff in our Atlanta facility alone. 8 more in Chicago, 3 in Washington, D.C. That's 28 documented incidents of bias-based treatment in just our airports. Denzel felt his jaw tighten. How many of these complaints were properly investigated? Robert flipped through several pages. According to their internal responses, all of them were deemed unfounded or resolved through additional training. But when I cross-referenced with our security footage and witness statements, a clear pattern emerges. He pulled out several photographs, screenshots from security cameras showing interactions between Atlantic Airways staff and passengers. In each image, the passengers being subjected to additional scrutiny or confrontational treatment were people of color. "This one is from last month," Robert said, pointing to a photo. A black woman traveling with her elderly mother was told her wheelchair assistance request was invalid despite having proper documentation. She missed her connecting flight. Another from 6 weeks ago. An Asian family was told their children were too disruptive for first class, despite other passengers confirming the children were well behaved. They were moved to coach without compensation. Each case represented not just poor customer service, but a systematic pattern of treating certain passengers as less deserving of respect and accommodation. Kendra looked up from helping Zara with her iPad. "How is this legal? How do they get away with it?" "The same way discrimination has always survived," Denzel replied, "by being subtle enough to deny, common enough to normalize, and profitable enough to ignore." But that was about to change. Helena's phone buzzed with an urgent call. She answered, listened for a moment, then looked up with wide eyes. "Sir, that was CNN. They've just received a statement from the Department of Transportation. They're opening a formal investigation into Atlantic Airways passenger treatment practices, citing your incident as evidence of potential civil rights violations." This was significant. Federal investigations could result in fines, operational restrictions, or even the revocation of an airline's license to operate. Robert pulled out another document. "I've also prepared our legal options. We have grounds to terminate Atlantic Airways operating agreements at all 3 of our airports immediately. They've violated the non-discrimination clauses in their contracts at least 28 times. Denzel considered the implications. Terminating Atlantic Airways access would cost them millions in revenue and strand thousands of passengers. But allowing them to continue operating while discriminating against travelers would make Washington Aviation Group complicit in that discrimination." "What's the impact if we terminate them?" he asked. Robert had already run the numbers. They have 47 daily flights across our 3 airports. That's about 8,000 passengers per day who would need alternative arrangements. Other airlines could absorb most of that traffic within a week, but there would be disruption. Helena added, "The media attention would be intense. You'd be the first airport operator to terminate a major airline for discrimination. It would send a message across the entire industry." Denzel looked at his family. Isaiah was reading news coverage of the incident on his phone, his expression growing more serious as he understood the scope of what was unfolding. Zara had fallen asleep in her wheelchair, exhausted by the day's events. Kendra was watching him with the expression she wore when she knew he was about to make a decision that would change their lives. "Draft the termination notice," Denzel said finally, "but don't send it yet. Give Atlantic Airways 24 hours to respond to our demands." "What demands?" Helena asked. Denzel stood up, looking out the lounge windows at the runways where Atlantic Airways planes were taking off and landing, carrying passengers who had no idea they were flying with an airline that had systematically discriminated against travelers who looked like his family. Immediate termination of Brad Sullivan, Jessica Miller, Ryan Peters, and any supervisor who approved their actions. Comprehensive bias training for all customer-facing staff conducted by an independent organization we approve. Implementation of our anti-discrimination monitoring systems at all facilities where they operate, and a $1 million contribution to civil rights organizations focused on travel equality. "If they refuse," Robert asked, "then they can find somewhere else to fly," Denzel replied. The ultimatum was unprecedented in the aviation industry. Airport operators rarely made such aggressive demands of airlines, and airlines rarely faced such specific accountability for discriminatory practices. But the story was no longer just about one incident at one gate. Thomas Reed's video had ignited a broader conversation about discrimination in travel, with passengers sharing their own experiences of being profiled, questioned, or mistreated by airline staff. The hashtag #FlyingWhileBlack had generated thousands of personal stories. A businessman from Houston described being interrogated about his first-class upgrade, while white passengers were welcomed without question. A college student from Detroit shared her experience of being selected for additional security screening on 12 consecutive flights. A family from Phoenix recounted being told their infant was too disruptive for the premium cabin, despite the baby being asleep. Each story added weight to the argument that what had happened to the Washington family wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern of systemic discrimination that had been tolerated, ignored, or actively covered up by airline management. Amanda Clark's Twitter thread had evolved into a comprehensive documentation of discriminatory practices across multiple airlines. Travel bloggers and civil rights attorneys were amplifying the conversation, demanding accountability and reform. Major celebrities began weighing in. A prominent actor shared his own experience of being questioned about his first-class ticket. A famous musician described being followed by security through an airport despite having done nothing suspicious. A well-known author wrote about the psychological impact of constantly being treated as a potential threat while traveling. The entertainment industry's involvement brought additional media attention, but it also highlighted an important point. If wealthy, famous Black Americans were experiencing discrimination while traveling, what was happening to ordinary families who didn't have the resources or platform to fight back? Evening news programs across the country led with the story. CNN's Anderson Cooper opened his show with Thomas Reed's video, followed by an interview with legal experts discussing the civil rights implications. Fox News covered the business angle, analyzing the potential financial impact on Atlantic Airways. MSNBC focused on the broader pattern of discrimination revealed by the social media response. But perhaps the most powerful coverage came from local news stations, which interviewed ordinary travelers about their own experiences. The stories were remarkably consistent. Black passengers subjected to additional scrutiny, questioned about their tickets, asked for extra identification, or treated with suspicion that white passengers never faced. Atlantic Airways' stock price had dropped 12% by the close of trading, as investors realized the company was facing not just a public relations crisis, but potential federal investigation, legal liability, and the loss of access to some of the nation's busiest airports. The airline's CEO, Richard Coleman, called an emergency board meeting for that evening. Helena Cross had contacts throughout the industry, and word reached her quickly about the panic spreading through Atlantic Airways' corporate headquarters. "They're considering offering you a settlement," she told Denzel as they prepared for his CNN interview. 7 figures, confidential agreement, public apology. Denzel's response was immediate and firm. "No confidential agreements. No settlements that silence us. This isn't about money. It's about changing a system that treats people like my daughter as less deserving of dignity because of their skin color." The CNN interview was scheduled for 9 p.m. Eastern, prime time, with an audience of millions. But Denzel had already decided what he would say, and it wasn't what Atlantic Airways wanted to hear. Meanwhile, across the country, Brad Sullivan sat in his small apartment in Atlanta, watching his career collapse in real time. His suspension from Atlantic Airways had been accompanied by a directive not to speak to media, but reporters had found his address and were camping outside his building. His phone had been buzzing constantly with calls from former colleagues, family members, and journalists seeking comment. The few friends who did reach him offered sympathy, but also questions about what he had been thinking, how he could have made such a catastrophic error in judgment. Jessica Miller had similarly isolated herself, staying with relatives outside the city while Atlantic Airways' legal team prepared for what was likely to be an expensive and embarrassing settlement process. Ryan Peters had already started updating his resume, knowing that his career in the aviation industry was effectively over. No airline would hire someone who had become the face of passenger discrimination, regardless of the outcome of Atlantic Airways' investigation. But the three employees were just the most visible casualties of a system that had enabled and normalized discriminatory treatment for years. The real reckoning was just beginning, and it would extend far beyond three individuals to encompass the corporate culture, management practices, and accountability systems that had allowed such behavior to flourish. As Denzel prepared for his interview, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. From that humiliating experience as a young man to owning the airports where he now set policy, from facing discrimination to becoming a powerful voice for change. The incident at Gate A12 would be remembered as a turning point, not just for his family, but for an entire industry that had too long operated under the assumption that some passengers mattered more than others. The consequences were only beginning to unfold, but one thing was already clear: the aviation industry would never be the same. At 9 p.m. Eastern Time, millions of Americans tuned in to CNN to watch Anderson Cooper's interview with Denzel Washington Jr. The network had promoted the segment extensively, and the audience was one of the largest for a primetime news interview in months. Denzel sat across from Cooper in CNN's New York studio, wearing the same navy polo shirt he had worn that morning at the airport. The decision to keep his casual appearance was deliberate. He wanted viewers to see him as he had appeared to the Atlantic Airways staff, to understand that their discrimination hadn't been based on anything he had done or said, but solely on their assumptions about who belonged in first class. Cooper opened the interview by playing Thomas Reed's video, the footage that had now been viewed over 2 million times. As they watched Brad Sullivan declare that the Washington family would not board the aircraft, Denzel's expression remained calm, but viewers could see the controlled anger in his eyes. When you were standing there being told you couldn't board your own airline at your own airport, what was going through your mind? Cooper asked. Denzel leaned forward slightly. I was thinking about my daughter Zara, who was watching her parents be treated like criminals for the crime of being black in first class. I was thinking about all the families who have experienced this same treatment but didn't have the resources or platform to fight back. And I was thinking that this needed to be the last time any family faced this kind of humiliation. Cooper pressed on the broader implications. You've now documented 28 similar incidents involving Atlantic Airways at your airports over the past 2 years. Why didn't this pattern trigger action sooner? That's the insidious nature of systemic discrimination, Denzel replied. Each incident gets explained away as a misunderstanding, a training issue, a one-off problem. The airline writes a letter, offers a voucher, and moves on. But when you look at the pattern, when you see that virtually every passenger subjected to this treatment shares certain characteristics, it becomes clear that this isn't about individual bad actors. This is about institutional bias. The interview continued for 30 minutes, with Denzel outlining the ultimatum he had given Atlantic Airways and his broader vision for reforming discrimination practices throughout the aviation industry. But perhaps the most powerful moment came when Cooper asked about the impact on his children. Isaiah is 16, old enough to understand that his family was targeted because of our race. Zara is 8, and she asked me why the airline people didn't want us on the airplane. How do you explain to an 8-year-old with a disability that some adults think she's less deserving of respect because of how she looks? Cooper nodded gravely. What did you tell her? I told her that some people make wrong assumptions about others, but that when good people see that happening, they stand up and say it's not okay. I told her that's why we're having this conversation now, so that other children won't have to experience what she experienced today. The interview generated immediate response across social media and news platforms. The hashtag #TellZara began trending, with thousands of people sharing messages of support for Denzel's daughter and stories of their own experiences with discrimination. But the real impact was felt in corporate boardrooms across the aviation industry. CEOs and executives who had been monitoring the situation realized that this wasn't a crisis they could wait out or manage with traditional public relations strategies. The Department of Transportation investigation, combined with the threat of losing access to Washington Aviation Group's airports, represented an existential threat to any airline that couldn't demonstrate a commitment to non-discriminatory practices. Within hours of the CNN interview, 5 major airlines issued statements pledging to review and strengthen their anti-discrimination policies. 3 others announced partnerships with civil rights organizations to develop new training programs. The Industry Trade Association scheduled an emergency meeting to address what they were calling the Washington Standards, the accountability measures that Denzel was demanding. Atlantic Airways faced the most immediate pressure. Their stock price had continued to fall, dropping 18% over 2 days. Travel booking sites were reporting cancellations of Atlantic flights, with customers citing the discrimination incident in their cancellation reasons. Major corporate clients were reviewing their travel policies, questioning whether they wanted their employees flying with an airline under federal investigation for civil rights violations. At 6 a.m. the following morning, Atlantic Airways CEO Richard Coleman placed a call to Denzel's office. Helena Cross took the call as instructed and listened to Coleman's proposal. "He's willing to meet all your demands," she reported to Denzel. "Immediate termination of the 3 employees, company-wide bias training, implementation of your monitoring systems, and the $1 million contribution to civil rights organizations." "What's the timeline?" Denzel asked. "He wants to announce the agreement today, with implementation beginning immediately." Denzel considered the offer. It was everything he had demanded, delivered faster than he had expected. But he also knew that corporate promises were only as valuable as the enforcement mechanisms that backed them. Tell him yes, but with one addition. Washington Aviation Group retains the right to conduct unannounced audits of Atlantic Airways discrimination compliance at any time, with findings made public. If they fail to maintain the standards they're agreeing to, the termination notice takes effect immediately. Helena made notes, and if he agrees, then we have a deal. But make it clear this is the last chance. If we see any evidence of continued discrimination, Atlantic Airways will lose access to all our facilities permanently. The agreement was announced that afternoon at a joint press conference in Atlanta. Richard Coleman stood beside Denzel in the same terminal where the incident had occurred, acknowledging that his airline had failed to meet acceptable standards and committing to comprehensive reform. The press conference was covered live by major networks, with reporters asking pointed questions about how such discrimination had been allowed to continue for so long. Coleman's answers were contrite but vague, while Denzel's responses were specific and demanding. "This agreement isn't just about Atlantic Airways," Denzel said when asked about the broader implications. "Every airline operating in our facilities will be held to these same standards. We're putting the entire industry on notice that discrimination will not be tolerated, covered up, or explained away." The immediate impact was dramatic. Within a week, Washington Aviation Group had received inquiries from 47 airlines seeking guidance on implementing similar anti-discrimination measures. Airport operations in other cities began reaching out, asking for advice on developing their own accountability systems. But perhaps the most meaningful change was happening at the individual level. Thomas Reed, whose Instagram live stream had captured the original incident, received thousands of messages from people thanking him for not looking away, for documenting what he witnessed instead of remaining silent. Amanda Clark's Twitter documentation had evolved into a comprehensive resource on travel discrimination, with legal experts and civil rights advocates using her thread as evidence of systemic problems in the industry. She had been invited to speak at conferences and had started a blog focused on discrimination in travel and hospitality. The passengers who had spoken up at Gate A12, who had formed a protective circle around the Washington family, became symbols of the kind of active allyship that could challenge discrimination when it occurred. Their actions had been captured on video and shared widely as examples of how bystanders could intervene when they witnessed unfair treatment. Elena Ruiz, the concierge who had stood up to her supervisors and confirmed the Washington family's reservation, had been promoted not just at the Atlanta facility but throughout the Washington Aviation Group system. Her courage in the face of potential job loss had made her a company-wide symbol of the values Denzel was trying to instill. 6 months after the incident, the changes were evident throughout the aviation industry. The Department of Transportation had issued new guidelines for investigating discrimination complaints, with mandatory public reporting requirements. The FAA had incorporated anti-discrimination compliance into its safety oversight programs. More than a dozen airlines had partnered with civil rights organizations to develop training programs that went beyond basic sensitivity awareness to address unconscious bias and systemic discrimination. Several had implemented monitoring systems similar to those required of Atlantic Airways, with real-time tracking of passenger complaint patterns and staff behavior. The financial impact had been significant as well. Airlines that demonstrated strong anti-discrimination records saw increases in bookings from minority travelers who had historically faced barriers and bias in aviation. Companies began advertising their commitment to respectful treatment as a competitive advantage. But the most important changes were happening in the day-to-day experiences of travelers. Passengers reported feeling more confident about filing complaints when they experienced discriminatory treatment, knowing that their concerns would be taken seriously and investigated thoroughly. Staff members at airports and airlines reported receiving better training and clearer guidance on treating all passengers with equal respect. Zara Washington, now 9 years old, traveled with her family regularly without the fear or anxiety that had marked her early flying experiences. She had become something of a celebrity in aviation circles, with airline staff at various airports recognizing her and ensuring she received exceptional care, not because of her father's position, but because she represented the kind of passenger experience the industry was committed to providing. Isaiah, now 17 and preparing for college, had chosen to write his admissions essays about the incident at Gate A12 and its aftermath. He wrote about witnessing his parents face discrimination with dignity, about learning to use privilege and platform to advocate for others, and about the responsibility that came with being part of a family that had changed an entire industry. The essays were powerful enough to earn him acceptance to several top universities, but more importantly, they reflected the young man he had become, someone who understood that fighting discrimination required constant vigilance and active engagement. Denzel himself had expanded his role beyond airport operations, becoming a leading voice in discussions about discrimination across multiple industries. His book about the aviation industry's transformation had become required reading in business schools and civil rights law programs. He testified before Congress about the importance of accountability systems in preventing institutional discrimination. But he never forgot that all of this change had started with a simple principle. Every passenger deserved to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their race, their appearance, or their economic status. The incident at Gate A12 had lasted less than an hour, but its impact would be felt for generations. It had demonstrated that discrimination could be challenged and defeated when people with power chose to use that power for justice, when bystanders chose to speak up instead of staying silent, and when systems of accountability were put in place to prevent bias from flourishing in darkness. Most importantly, it had shown that change was possible, that even deeply entrenched patterns of discrimination could be broken when enough people decided that the status quo was no longer acceptable. The transformation of the aviation industry had begun with one family's refusal to accept unequal treatment. It would continue with every passenger who insisted on dignity, every employee who chose courage over compliance, and every leader who understood that true success meant creating systems where everyone could travel with confidence and respect. The journey was far from over, but the destination was clear. An aviation industry where incidents like the one at Gate A12 were not just rare, but Impossible, because the systems, training, and culture had been fundamentally transformed to ensure that every passenger's journey began with respect and ended with satisfaction. As Denzel often said in his speeches about the incident, "We didn't just fight for our right to fly in first class, we fought for everyone's right to be treated as first-class human beings, regardless of where they sit on the plane." That fight had been won, but the work of maintaining and expanding that victory would continue for years to come. And every time a family boarded a plane without fear of discrimination, every time an airline employee chose respect over bias, every time a passenger stood up for someone being treated unfairly, the legacy of that moment at Gate A12 would live on. The flight crew that had refused a black family their upgrade had inadvertently triggered the most comprehensive reform of discrimination practices in aviation history. They had thought they were enforcing their own prejudices, but instead they had unleashed a force for change that would reshape their entire industry. And in the end, that may have been the most important lesson of all, that every act of discrimination carries within it the seeds of its own destruction, waiting for the right moment, the right person, and the right platform to bloom into justice.